Section 30 of Open the Door. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leena Emsley. Open the Door by Catherine CARSWELL. Book 3, Chapter 4. 1. She had slept, and in the train next day on her way to London, she was still able to rest. Her body was weak, but safe. After the alternation of sharp, riving pain and dull stupor, which had been her existence for the last 2 days, this was almost happiness. In the barn-like Waverley station, wherein the passengers seemed like so many strewn grains from the threshing, she had slipped clear of her trouble. She, too, was now but a grain, a speck, whereas last night her heart had filled the universe with its heavy and clamorous throbbing. In this restored proportion, she had only her infinitesimal part in the whole, and it was enough. Behind her lay great misery. Before her, in London, she knew that more awaited her. But she might make of this journey a quiet breathing space, a narrow oasis in which for an hour she could forget the choking desert. Having no stomach yet for everyday victuals, she had bought herself a little, rare basketful of fruit. Here was a knot of grapes, the colour of glacier water. Here were 2 granadillas, passion fruit flowers, with their tough rinds full of luscious, translucent globules. Here were almonds to crunch, a white-fleshed apple into which to drive one's teeth, a peach from which the velvet-scented skin came glibly away. Leaning back idly in the corner of an empty compartment, she watched the wheeling countryside. It was a poet's May morning, one of those mornings when white clouds are piled up and gleaming, and the sunshine lies like snow along the hedges. Young lambs that might themselves have been snow-leavings were scattered upon the emerald grass. A faint, low haze of hyacinths hovered in the bare woods. In one small station, through which the train passed without stopping, the steep banks were rich with crocuses that had already been split and ravished, with crocuses that were flaming their lives out like passionate lamps. Joanna sat on that side of the train next to the corridor, and every now and then, passing between her and the Lothians, some passenger would blot out a whole brown woodland or amber-coloured field or bare hill of palest amethyst. To her at the moment, one broad obscuring back was like another. She hardly realised, therefore, that a particular pair of tweed shoulders returned again and again, until they came at length to a hesitating standstill opposite the door of her compartment. Even when the door opened, and a man's brown face looked in with inquiring friendliness, and a lean hand was stretched out, and her name warmly uttered, even then it was several moments before she realised that the stranger was her old playmate, Bob Rankin. "Joanna, it is you!" "Why, Bob!" He wrung her hand and sat down opposite, smiling, taking off his hat, looking at her with evident pleasure. Joanna, too, looked at him. He was the same old Bob. After the first shock of shyness and strangeness, she saw that he had not really changed. He was bigger, older, and certain marks of worldly assurance were as clear as the deep sun-wrinkles that surrounded his eyes. But the African sun had not burned away the spiritual indecision lurking about his attractive lips, nor informed the almost callow innocence of his gaze. "Do come into our carriage," he begged her schoolboyishly. "My father is there with me. I thought and thought it must be you, but your hat hid your eyes and I wasn't positive." "I wonder you knew me at all," said Joanna. "I am changed more than you, I think. Am I not changed?" "Yes and no," he replied. "I felt a bit afraid of the dashing-looking female I first caught sight of, but now that I have a good look at you, I can see the old Joanna. I wish you'd take your hat off. Would you have known me?" "Anywhere." "Yet you didn't when I first came in and stuck out my paw at you." "No, I was half asleep." "Asleep? You didn't look it." "Thinking, then." "Ah." He searched her face curiously as she rose, and they went together to the other carriage, where Dr. Rankin sat reading, with one plaid about his shoulders and another over his knees. The old minister looked fragile indeed, but he had maintained a brittle alertness. He smiled his wintry yet rather sweet smile at Joanna, and made her sit by him while he asked about her doings and about her brothers, mentioning both by name, and about Georgie and Georgie's baby. It was a clear and pleasing point of vanity with him, this individual remembrance which he kept of each boy and girl who had ever had a place in his flock, and Joanna was the more surprised, as in her childhood he had never seemed to them to notice their existence. Certainly his former bleakness was gone. Time, sometimes generous, had given him with his white locks a distinction quite denied to his middle age, and it was perhaps his own appreciation of this that made him genial. "And your mother?" he said presently. "I was sorry, very sorry, to hear of her death. Your mother, my dear, was a good woman?" "Yes," said Joanna. "I never knew a better. And she had courage, a rare gift. A gift I esteem not less but more as I grow older. True, theologically, we did not always see eye to eye, your mother and myself." He twinkled. So they talked mostly of the early days in Glasgow, of St. Jude's Church, of the Boyds, of this one's death, that one's marriage, the disgrace of that other, and the old man was lively in his interest. As for the young man, he sat smoking and watching, seldom speaking. In answer to Joanna's questions, he told her a little about his work, and she divined that he loved the part of the world where it was. Laconically, as he spoke, there was enthusiasm in his description of a certain high mountain which dominated the landscape visible from his bungalow. But if Bob took no great part in the conversation, he was all the more intent in listening to every least remark of Joanna's. When they parted at King's Cross, he was emphatic upon the strange coincidence of their meeting. He had meant, he said, the very next day to have sought her out at Chapel Court. Might he still come? He was to be at the least a fortnight in London. Joanna could not but see that his eyes were full of eager reminiscence. 2. But at the Moon's house there was trouble. Roddy, who had fallen ill suddenly, was to be operated upon next day. Edwin Moon was white with anxiety. Trissy was grey. He was bowed more than ever. She was more than ever upright. Dreadfully upright she was, with her shoulders thrown back and her desperate head held high. They had taken the liberty, they told Joanna upon her arrival, when the bad news was poured out, of using her bedroom as the sick chamber. It was the most suitable in the house, and they could not bear to have the child taken to a nursing home. Already the stripped walls were hung with sheets drenched in carbolic, and the scrubbed kitchen table stood shockingly in the middle of a bare floor. During the week that followed, Joanna, sleeping on the sofa in her sitting-room, gave every minute of her time and every ounce of her strength to the racked household. She cooked, ran errands, found a substitute for Trissy at the laundry, interviewed customers downstairs for Mr. Moon, helped to tend the unwitting Edwina, and so long as all went well with Roddy, she was content. While the distraction of illness lasted, her own essential life stayed apart, suspended. It was a respite. And the operation was a success. Roddy emerged from it his entire bright self. It seemed there was no further cause for anxiety. Yet Trissy's face remained tense and ashen as before, nor would Edwin leave the bedside. That night, though she was very weary, Joanna lay sleepless. With Roddy out of danger, her own troubles were again unleashed, and now like hounds they threatened her. She stayed broad awake till after sunrise. Then, when she had newly fallen into a drowse, came a touch on her shoulder. She sat up instantly. It was Trissy, who said a low word and was gone. Joanna leapt up, threw on her dressing-gown and followed. An hour before dawn, nearly 20 hours after the surgeon's work was satisfactorily completed, the child had begun to look strange about the eyes. Then he had slipped by slow, obstinate degrees into unconsciousness. Now he was in a coma. Coma was the word that had remained with Joanna when Trissy had spoken and vanished. It was a most uncommon case, declared the puzzled physician. The surgeon, having performed his task and being busy elsewhere, did not appear. But he thought they would pull a little chap through. Trissy's eyes widened in murderous disbelief, till the white glared all round the irises, but she carried out every direction submissively and well, winning the doctor's praise. There never had been such a nurse. As for Edwin Moon, through each unfolding horror of activity around the bed, he only sat with his head hanging, looking on without hope, quite passive. Twice in the course of the day they managed to rouse the boy so that he uttered conscious and natural cries of protest, and after the second of these times he lay a while quiet, and was his composed self as if he would recover. The father raised his head then, and gazed into his son's open eyes, and Roddy, as if he had been waiting for this, smiled back at him contentedly. So they would have remained, but the mother bent forward, thrusting herself between them in her terrible jealousy. "How does my sonny feel now?" she asked, curbing her frenzy with an effort that almost killed her, into a tone of gentle ordinariness. At this, Roddy only moved his head restlessly, searching past his mother with feeble impatience for his father's lost face. "How's my sonny?" she repeated, this time a fine jet of agony breaking through in her voice. "Much better, thank you." Roddy spoke with a politeness he used to strangers, and again he sought his father's eyes. Trissy turned away. Her face was like some crude, grinning mask of tragedy. But the child had scarcely spoken before consciousness flickered out again. An hour, 2 hours, of unbroken stupor followed, do what they would. And then the small, square fingertips began to curve strangely outwards, like young leaves that are too near a flame, and he grew cold, and one long, long breath was the last he would ever draw. The mother, her eyes wide and unseeing, stayed by the dead boy, and the father, having composed the small limbs, wandered slowly from the room. 3. It was on the night before the burial that Trissy found relief in a stream of incoherent speech which seemed as though it had been pent up for ages and now could never have an end. Edwin, she told Joanna, had gone out, and would probably walk the streets till morning, as he had done many a time before. This was not their first trouble. What else indeed but trouble had they known these many years? She sat on the little rocking-chair in the archway room that midnight, and her story, or what she thought was her story, came from her in a bitter confusion of words. When all had been said, Joanna knew little more about the Moons than she had already gathered half-consciously by living with them. She learned indeed for the first time that Moon was not their real name, and that the name they had foregone was one well thought of in a northern county, where once they had lived prosperously. But what Edwin had done, saving that it had been an act of criminal folly by which he had nothing to gain and everything to lose, all Trissy's incontinence did not disclose. He had done it, declared Trissy, when he was not himself, for he had never been himself since the day when his pet Edwina, from being a lovely, lively child of 2, had within an hour become the thing she now was. Was it any wonder if, crazed by this blow, he had thought for a time that certain babies were better not to be born into the world at all? Be that as it might, such thoughts had led to a disaster from which his life and hers had never recovered. Ill luck had dogged them ever since. Here was the burden of Trissy's lament. Here, in the steady, incorrigible tracking down by misfortune, it was Edwin whom the pursuing furies had marked for their prey. She, Trissy, had been born, she was sure of it, for good fortune. It was this knowledge that had bred in her a bitter envy of Joanna's youth and freedom, an envy she now begged to be forgiven. She had always been known as a lucky person, and was convinced she would be still, were it not for Edwin. It was Edwin who had spoiled her life, who had cheated her of her happiness, who had brought upon her one trouble after another, and he had done it in all innocence. Therein lay his offence, any wickedness. Again and again Trissy wildly repeated this phrase. Any wickedness, she could have forgiven him. for then she could have cut herself off from him. If he were a guilty man, she could have gone free, been happy. Once, just before the birth of Roddy, she had tried to leave him, and he had told her she was free to do the best for herself. But he was an innocent man. It was only that fate had marked him as a prey, and how could she leave this Jonah, this victim, this man set apart for vengeance, by whose side nothing could prosper? So the wife raved and wept. But on the day of the burial, Joanna came nearer to the true heart of the mystery. In the church, and afterwards by the graveside, she saw how the strange couple clung each to the other, and there was that in their clinging which was more than the ordinary holding together for comfort of married mourners. To Joanna it seemed to proclaim their secret from the housetops. The moons, like Phemy and Jimmy, possessed what she in her own unfulfilled being must envy. 4. Now she would have to go back to her own life. But the day before, it had seemed as if she might live only in Trissy's life and in entire devotion to Trissy's unhappiness. Now she knew that Trissy did not need her. The husband and wife had cast her out by the grave. She had no part with them. She must go on again alone, with what was no longer a life, but only a dying and a denial. So it was that in the weeks that followed, Roddy's death ceased to cause her any personal grief. It became merely another incident in the recession of all life from her. For days on end she was shorn of herself, shorn of the world, shorn of the old assured existence for which her mother at one end and Lewis at the other had supremely stood. She was denuded even of the warm and exquisite fleece of memory. She had no past, no living present, no conceivable future. But under all her deathliness was one grain of faith, that death must be fulfilled to the utmost before any new birth can be. She lay abandoned, waiting in a perfection of emptiness. 5. But to die is not so easy. To die, that is, the death in which is clenched the seed of a new birth. There are pangs in it of false resurrection, dreadful like the return of Lazarus. As in the death of the body, the will revives time after time and fights. Appalled and faithless, the consciousness struggles in the very act of dissolution to be again what it was, to escape its appointed re-entry into the dark womb of extinction. In these weeks, there were mornings when Joanna woke full of a gnawing malaise for Lewis. Then all her memories, fiendish but clad like angels, would leap to their deathly work. All the old lies would raise their plausible flat heads, denying the possibility of true renewal. Back, back, back she must go into safety, back to haven, back to the known system, which swung securely between the psalm-singing sunset faith of her fathers and the exquisite underworld of moonlight and falling leaves wherein Lewis had his dwelling. Resignation, renunciation, sacrifice, these thrust forward their false, lovely faces, and all their pleadings were for the revival of self-insistence under the mask of immolation. For even in extremis a choice is left, and the will has its part. Joanna had lost Lewis, but there was still a way in which she might refuse to go from him. The very circumstances of their love which had kept them apart for months at a time, the fact that in her dealings with him she had been clear of pettiness, his assurance in the train that he had not so much changed toward her as broken down in himself, all these offered her that way of death in life which is chosen every day that passes by people of her nature. She could be faithful to Lewis. She could refuse to forget and to go on. With loyal, obstinate submissiveness, she could turn her life into a shrine. She had seen the faces of women who had done this. Was it not the best way when one had so deeply committed oneself? It was not the way of the new birth, but it lay at hand. It showed the signpost of authority. One could travel it, and not yield up one's will. Or on other days a different brood of devils would crowd in upon her. These had features less like Julie's than the last, and more like Lewis's. They were full of pleasantry and mocking reasonableness. Why take so tragically, they asked, what was probably only one of her lover's bad moods? It was a question of time and good sense being what she had chiefly lacked. He had behaved badly, no doubt, but she might have managed him if she hadn't been so painfully in earnest. She might still, with time, coolness and skill, win him afresh. Or quite suddenly she would find herself caught up in a whirlpool of hatred and all-encompassing spite. Why should Lewis go free while she was thus tormented? She would then ask. Could she not make him suffer, persecute him, even kill him? Why not? As man to desperate woman, his would be the disadvantage. He was spared by her scruples, not by her fears. It was no matter what became of her, so that she could wreak herself once and for all upon him. When she dragged him out before his world that he so feared, ranted forth her mind at him, showed him like a beaten cur to his wife and his son's wife, made the seemliness he so treasured impossible for him forthwith, she could complete the work by killing herself. What was to prevent her? Nothing. Nothing, save that in spite of all, she knew she was finally prompted in respecting Lewis's obduracy. Something whispered that it was not all cowardice for him to have cast her off, that beneath the maddening incidents of their parting he had taken a step which was intrinsically decent. Was not his action in harmony with the unknown forces that had long been driving her out of his world? What if the break between them had sprung from his refusal to drag her further into his own long dying? So she took no decisive action, and the only outcome of all her stormy hours was some letters. She could not help writing letters to Lewis that were by turns exalted, self-abasing, passionate, reasonable, threatening, and simply appealing. Lewis replied by one letter only. "You must allow me to act," he wrote at last, "as I think best. Believe me, I'm saving you from yourself, as well as, in another way, saving myself from you. I don't want to see you. I won't. It could serve no purpose except to hurt us both, and what's the use of that? I haven't exactly changed in my feeling toward you. I meant every word, and more, that I ever spoke to you. You know that well enough, I expect. There will never be anyone else to count. There never was anyone else that meant at all the same as you have meant, and I suppose still mean, to me. It may seem strange to you when I say I care every bit as much as I ever have, possibly more. I confess it seems strange to me. Certainly I didn't expect anything of the kind when we began. But something has gone dead in me, Joanna. I can't go on. That's what I realized on the journey to Edinburgh when I was so awfully tired. Quite suddenly, once and for all, I realized it. I can't go on. And in this of ours, we must go on or make an end. Don't you agree? As I see things now, it has been tug and tug between us this long time past, perhaps the whole time. If I'd had it in me, I would have gone off with you long ago. You always wanted that, I know, and once or twice I have fancied that I could, but I know now that I never could have. It would only have been a sickening disaster for both of us if I had tried. Perhaps I was too old when you got me. You don't know yet what that feels like, and you ought to be thankful. Anyhow, there it is. It has wanted courage for me to cut loose from you and stay behind. You must have the courage to cut loose from me and go on. I believe you can do this. But whatever you do, don't make things ugly and regrettable at the end by asking the impossible of me. I'm sure I've done you no harm, and I hope I may have done you good. Let me alone, my dear, with my memories. Be sure a man never had sweeter ones. Be sure I wish you well, and am forever grateful. Your old lover, Lewis. If many a time in his love-making Joanna had been driven to make excuses to herself for her lover, in his withdrawal he rose far beyond any need of apology. If she indeed had it in her to go forward into a new, unimagined life, here in this letter would lie her dearest trophy from the old. 6. During the futile weeks that followed, she even took to visiting fortune-tellers. It was a tribe that had never before caught her attention, but the days must be passed somehow. Though she despised herself for it, and had little enough money to spare from necessities, she would put down a preposterous fee eagerly for the false excitement it brought, would wait trembling in the frowsy antechamber of the oracle, and once, when some hag of the Edgware Road hinted at what might be construed into a marriage after many years with Lewis, she went home with a lighter step, to know within the hour that it was a shameful drug. This, however, did not prevent her from repeating the same folly, and she continued fitfully to go from one soothsayer to another.
"I see a dark, no, a fair man,"
droned the Sibyl. This time she was rich in her appointments, and herself young, large, and comely as a stalled ox.
"I see a medium fair man, still young. Yes, the first love. His thoughts are toward you. There was a break. Both were at fault. Years have passed, but he has been faithful, and now his heart is set toward his first love. I see happiness, money, children. 2 boys. No, a boy and a girl. Seas to be crossed, many storms in the past, but happiness close at hand."
She sank back in her chair, as if utterly exhausted, drew the black velvet over her glass ball, and closed her eyes. And Joanna was impressed. During the last fortnight, Bob Rankin had continually sought her company. Noticing her drooping spirits, he had insisted more than once upon her going out with him to dinner in town, and had taken her to a theatre afterwards. And that very afternoon, on her return to Chapel Court, she met him coming dejectedly away after a vain call there. In a week he would be leaving England, so she had to allow him to turn back with her and to sit talking in her room. She had only to look at him to know how very easily she might make the crystal gazer's prophecy come true. She was tempted. She did not love Bob, but he still had the power to stir a curious tenderness in her. Also, it was dangerously sweet and flattering, especially coming upon the heels of such humiliation as could hardly be borne, to have stumbled upon the fulfilment of an old dream. After all these years, Bob wanted her. There would not only be safety with him, but as well a kind of newness which promised much. What of the mountain he could see from his bungalow, the African veld, different skies, dark faces, yet another escape? And with Bob, however fond a wife she might become, she knew that she would be able to keep her essential being intact, a shrine for Lewis to the end. But Joanna's will, which had so often served her badly, served her well in this, and that day she put the temptation aside. Better never be than be so falsely, foisting at the same time falseness upon another. So she turned from him, and denied him every chance of speaking, and the next week Bob left England as he had come. 7. She visited no more palmists. She did nothing, and went nowhere, neither worked nor read. The long-preserved shell of habit had crumbled at last. But although acquiescence might mean open ruin, she could only wait passively. She could not move without some vital prompting. It was not till the middle of June that the first hint of direction came to her, the first faint summons bidding her live anew. And as once before, in the life that was now dead and discarded, it came in the shape of a letter from Aunt Purdy.
"I am passing," she wrote, "through a time of hideous, lonely suffering. The powers of darkness in the heavens above are doing all they can to kill my heart and brain. 'Tis dreadful to be like me, open to invisible influences, for by the same means I am both aided and hindered. Pray for Auntie, whose heart is almost breaking, and who is presently without love or hope of any kind, and feels miserably conquered. Come to see her if you possibly can."
To this Joanna sent no answer, but she moved out of her lethargy and made simple preparations for a journey to Italy. To raise the money, she found she must sell some of her treasures, but she did so without a pang. Not that there was any excitement or expectancy in her, as there had been when she had responded to her aunt's first summons. Now she was simply obedient to the seeming accident through which her new, untried life could stir. Her will no longer rose hard and possessive, driving her hither and thither. Her will now was merely the helm by which her frail bark might once more be steered to float upon a stream of life. But what other power had urged her to respond, whither the stream might bear her, she did not ask. Not that even now she was quite beyond the reach of a deathly backwash. In the late afternoon of the day before her departure, when nothing remained to do, she found herself overwhelmed once more by the old sadness. There was the deep chair in which Lewis and she had so often kissed and held each other. Here was a case she had come upon while packing, full of his letters and drawings. There on the mantelpiece was the Tanagra figurine, with blown-out drapery, which he had brought her from Paris, declaring it was like her. All the little room spoke of him, and of what he stood for. And mingling with these passionate memories were thoughts of Roddy, who was dead, of Ollie, who was soon going to Canada, to make the third in a patched-up reconciliation between her parents. Wrenched with sobbing, she lay back in the shadowed room. She cried a long time, so that when at length she was done, the evening had drawn greyly in. But she did not stir to light the lamp, and even when rain began to fall, beating more and more heavily against the black window-panes, she had no thought of drawing the curtains. There seemed no reason why she should ever move again. From shaking storm she had lapsed into stillness. Never before had she been sunk so deep in the blessed wells of nothingness. How many minutes or hours passed then, she did not know, but the room had long been quite dark when a sound from downstairs made her slip free of her abandonment in the low chair and stand alert, listening. Her ears served her so beautifully at that moment that she could separate each from each, as an embroideress might separate a skein of coloured silken threads. All the faint vibrations of sound in the house. She heard Trissy open the door and parley with a visitor. It was impossible to distinguish words, but she knew immediately that Lawrence's was the low voice asking if she was in, and she could supply the answer in Trissy's doubtful murmur. The next moment she was leaning over the wide-topped old banister of the staircase. "I'm here," she heard her own voice assuring Trissy, and almost before she had spoken, there was Lawrence standing before her. On the little dark landing they could see each other's faces as pale blurs only. "How wet you are!" she exclaimed, as he touched her hand with his, all cold with the rain, and she could smell the rain-soaked wool of his clothes. "Yes, it's pouring." He followed her into the room while she groped for matches and lighted the lamp, and now, instead of her ears, it was her hands that moved with a new perfection and certitude that almost frightened her. The wick caught evenly all around, and as the twin flames sprang up bright and smokeless in the funnel, Lawrence's eyes were upon her. Her face, she knew then, must be ravaged and unsightly from her long crying. At any former time of her life, above all with Lewis, she would have shaded the unmerciful light hastily, turning her face aside the while. But this evening, with Lawrence, she had no more impulse to conceal it than she had to display it for his sympathy. Raising her head, she returned his look starkly, and thus they both stood for a long second, with the revealing lamp between them. "Yes?" Joanna asked him. That he would only have come to her on some urgent errand she knew of herself, and if she had not known it, his white, fixed face would have told her that something decisive had happened to him. But he had seen her now, and in his eyes his own trouble made way for hers. "What's wrong?" he demanded, instead of replying to her question. "Nothing is wrong. I've been crying. I'm all right now. I'm going to Italy tomorrow." It seemed odd to her that he should show no surprise. "To Italy you are going," he said. "I'm going away too. That's what I came tonight to say." Joanna was the one to be astonished. His way of speaking was strange. "Where are you going?" she asked, wondering. "I don't know yet. Nor for how long. North, probably. It really doesn't matter, though I think I'm about due a holiday." "I'm afraid you are ill. You look ill," said Joanna anxiously. There was that kind of sharpness in his features which often presages severe illness. But he assured her brusquely that it was only a cold hanging about him. "How long will you be in Italy?" She did not know. She begged him to hurry home and change his clothes. "Goodbye, then," Lawrence said, holding out his hand. "It was mostly to tell you that I was going away that I came. I couldn't help coming, and now I feel you are going south for the same reason I am going north. You have to come to an end, really come to an end at last. Is it so?" Joanna nodded. She was full of wonder, yet it seemed natural that he should know about her. "I have been at an end now for ages," she said. "The thing is there any new beginning?" "For you, I feel there must be. For me, I see none," replied Lawrence. "I'm simply down and out. Last time we talked I was glib enough. I thought I knew what it was, but I didn't." "Would he stay?" Joanna asked him shyly. "Would he sit down a while? Would talking be any use?" But he shook his head. So she went downstairs to the door with him. The yard was spouting with rain, and rivulets of rain coursed under the archway. As Lawrence and she clasped hands, Joanna loved the sound of it. "Endings have to be gone through by each one alone," said he. "But I doubt if ever a true beginning was solitary." And with that he was gone into the dark slanting curtain of the rain. As she went slowly back to her room, she dared hardly believe in the virgin jet of promise that bubbled tinily, limpidly up through her own nothingness. End of section 30. Section 31 of Open the Door. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leena Emsley. Open the Door by Catherine CARSWELL. Book 3, Chapter 5, Part 1. 1.
"I told you,"
persevered the voice of Irene's holiday governess,
"that some seeds and some fruits, too, have wings. Can either of you tell me the name of a tree that has a winged fruit? Come, Carola, you try. The rain might go off if you would stop looking at it."
At one end of the long country drawing-room she sat with her 2 little girl pupils, filling in the slow half-hour before tea with a nature talk. At the other end Irene was having an argument with Aunt Georgina, and the murmur of the children at their lessons made a kind of droning counterpoint for the more acrimonious voices of their mother and grandmother.
"This is just a fad of yours, Irene,"
declared the elder speaker inclemently.
"About the children needing sea air in August. I never heard such rubbish. Compared with these hills, the sea's a nasty, bilious place."
It was now 2 years since the widowed Lady Westermere had left Edinburgh and come to live at the small Perthshire estate from which her husband had taken his judicial title, and in this June afternoon, the very same afternoon upon which her niece, Joanna, was speeding south on the first wind of chance, she was seated by a window that looked out upon the Grampians.
"A mere doctor's fad," she pursued. "They would be far better here with me till October. Broadstairs, too, of all places."
While her daughter crouched shivering by the fire, the old woman herself had made no further concession to the weather than by having thrust her feet into a deerskin hassock. She sat steely and erect on a straight-backed chair before her desk in the deep window bow that was her favourite post, and this though the mountain prospect that she loved was quite gone in mist. Mist chill, heavy and sopping on this day of summer, had left nothing for the disconsolate eye to rest upon, save a drenched garden terrace, some shrubs weighted with the rain, and a broken regiment of tiger lilies. "My dear mother," returned Irene in a tone of martyrdom which her mother guessed was due less to maternal anxiety than to her grievance at having had to leave London in the middle of the season. "You surely don't imagine that I like our summer arrangements, but you see for yourself that Carola has had one cold upon another since we came here, and after bronchitis so lately." "Look," went on the persistent undertone of the lesson. "This is the seed of the ash, a single seed in a sheath which is really a wing. It is called a samara. See the twist that helps it to fly. And this is a sycamore fruit with 2 wings. "Can it really fly, Miss Frew?" asked Carola, the elder child, suddenly taking some interest. "Like a bird?" "It can whirl along in the wind for miles and miles." "The child doesn't go out enough," announced Carola's grandmother. "Suppose it fell on a stone, Miss Frew?" "Then, if it lived long enough, it would have to wait for another wind to blow it to a place where it could sprout and take root." "Would you have her go out on a day like this?" "Most certainly I should. To hear you, one would hardly think you were a Scotswoman at all." A fine metallic thread of contempt was one of the strands in the withered old voice. "Suppose the wind blew it onto another stone, and another stone, lots more stones, Miss Frew, or into the sea." "I don't hold," Aunt Georgina still spoke, "with your doctor's fiddle-faddle about bronchitis and sea air and nonsense. However, I see your mind is made up, and after all, they're only my grandchildren, not my children." "For one seed that sprouts, millions and millions only rot every year." "Do billions and billions rot?" asked Phyllis, the younger child, speaking for the first time. "I suppose so." "And trillions and trillions, Miss Frew?" "I dislike having the house to myself in the autumn, and most people have made their plans by now. Of course, I might ask one of your cousins, Sholto's girls. It has been in my mind for some time to ask Joanna. Joanna used to be fond of the country, and has no home of her own to go to these days. That is the one thing I will say for your poor Aunt Julie. She brought her children up to be hardy. I remember how they used to run about in all weathers like so many young colts. Yes, I shall tell Joanna to come in August and see her old aunt." 2. At the moment when Aunt Georgina's invitation was being fastened in its envelope, Joanna, a little dazed by her long journey, stood once more by the widely spilled water of Torre del Lago. She stood looking across the white expanse that 7 years before had marked the turning of her life from dream to reality. Clearly she now knew that turning for what it was, but part of her inevitable progression towards death. She had lived out the dream, had embraced the reality, and now death was fulfilled in her. She saw that, however different might have been the circumstances of her travelling in it, for her at least there could have been no other progression. Now it might be that death was her portion, or it might be that out of her very recognition and acceptance of death, a new life might spring. It came to her that the world was walked by thousands who were dead, and whose true deathliness lay in their continued assertion of life. Such life, surely, was mere putrefaction, and from putrefaction came no new life worth having. The phoenix could not rise anew but from its acknowledged ashes. Anyhow, she relinquished all claim to the old life. She rested in the void, and was content to bide her time without a single defiant reaching forth. And while Joanna climbed the steep winding path to the cottage, since her last visit there was no change in the hillside, save that now on every hand the cherry trees declared themselves from among the olives by their brighter fruit. Aunt Georgina, in her old age sometimes generous on second thoughts, was reopening her invitation and inserting a cheque. 3. Though the door stood open, Aunt Purdy was not in the cottage, nor was she in the garden. Aurora, however, larger and handsomer than ever, with 2 babies grabbing at her skirts, was there cutting artichokes, and upon catching sight of the unlooked-for visitor, she uttered a cry of mingled surprise and welcome.
But what? Of course she remembered the Signorina Scorsese, but the misfortune, the poor Signora Del Monte—
it was by this name that Aunt Purdy was known to the district—
taken ill suddenly, had only the day before been fetched away by the other Signora, her sister, doubtless also well known to the Signorina, who had at Turin the fine house and a distinguished family. At Turin, for certain, the Signora Del Monte would be well cared for.
Nor did Aurora expect her return for some weeks. What was to be done? Joanna did nothing, and suggested nothing. She merely stayed quietly on at the cottage. While she felt no particular relief at her aunt's absence, neither did she feel any disappointment, and Aurora, seeing this, fell in with it unquestioningly. She waited on the niece as she had waited on the aunt, as a matter of course, and Joanna, with her return ticket safe, was able to eke out over some 6 weeks money that in London would hardly have lasted for one. Between the garden and the orchard, with eggs and an occasional fowl from Aurora, she found food enough, and other needs she had none. Occupation there was for her in plenty. She washed and mended whatever of Aunt Purdy's she could find that needed repair, put the cottage in shining order, weeded and dug in the garden, and between whiles she lay for hours at a time on the garden's highest ridge, from where she could gaze upon the wide, sparkling sweep of the sea. Often then she remembered those sea-going ships upon the Clyde that had nearly drawn the childish heart out of her breast. But up till now all her adventures had been inland. Only now was she loosed, if so be the capacity lay in her at all, for the true voyage. But the will to shape circumstances or to force an issue was gone from her. She had become submissive to the uncomprehended current of events. She did not grieve or rejoice. She did not live. She only waited. And when Aunt Georgina's letter reached her, she accepted the invitation. The wind had blown her south. Now the wind was to blow her north. Free as a flying seed, she still was, as is a seed, at the mercy of the winds. When would she be driven to the place where she might strike her roots and at last raise her leaf and her bud? She recalled Mr. Moon's legend of the bird of paradise. It was one thing to die to the world, to devour the sweet spices and so forever lose your foothold. It was another to find a resting place in some new way of life. She could still feel the lake swallows digging into her palms with their frantic claws, but of what use was their escape to them, if escape were all? Was Lawrence too, she wondered, without a foothold in the world? It seemed to her that for a man the whole scheme of things must be different. Yet he too, as she could not forget, had conceived of his life as a seed foiled of its consummation. 4. August was nearly over when one evening she stepped down from the train at a Highland junction to be driven 10 miles along wet, bog-scented roads to Aunt Georgina's house, which she then saw for the first time. It stood, whitewashed and foursquare on its hill, with no creepers to break its bareness, a typical Perthshire dwelling of the severer sort, set in good though not showy grounds. And on its wide semicircular steps, confronting the terrace and the watery sunset, stood its mistress, awaiting her guest. Joanna, who first caught sight of the straight, unmistakable figure from a turn in the drive, was surprised by a familiar tremor. Since her mother's funeral, when all family relations were abnormal, she had not seen her aunt, nor had she slept under her roof oftener than twice in the last 10 years. And if, in middle age, Lady Westmere had been a person to strike terror into young bosoms, in old age she was even more intimidating. True, at that moment, in the yellow light that beat up against her from the wet gravel, turning her widow's cap with its precise goffering into a moulding of pale brass, she might, from the waist downward, have stood to a sculptor for the figure of Charity. The folds of her skirts, black now instead of prune-coloured, flowed out so generously at either side, ballooning slightly in the air as she advanced. But no Caritas ever kept shoulders so erect as these under the brown and scarlet paisley shawl, and the triumphant clash of cymbals would better than any more Christian music have expressed these leonine features. Yet Joanna's fear proved after all to be but a ghost of a bygone subjection. Being faced with its object, it passed so wholly that it only served to mark the distance she had travelled. For without doubt she emerged unshaken from the stately embrace, the condescending greeting, and the critical old stare. 2 days later, the morning gave promise of sunshine, even of heat, after a spell of rain, and Aunt Georgina decided that she would pay a call upon one of her more distant neighbours, a retired sheriff, whose house lay a few miles from Perth on the further side. As she had not visited there before, a map was produced and laid open on the breakfast table, and that her younger eyes might be made use of, Joanna was seated before it. It was only then that there came to her as a perfect astonishment what she must long before have known, had her childish geography not been of the haziest and never amended. Westmuir lay within 20 miles of Duntarvie. Incredible as it may seem, she had never thought of Duntarvie as having a place upon the map. Deeply shaken, she traced the district with her forefinger. Duntarvie, and close to it upon the printed map, Drumwarry, the farm where Alec Peddy had lived. Before her eyes were the names of villages, streams, and hills, which till now had seemed names in a tale. The cob had gone lame, and Lady Westmuir did not consider the small pony equal to her weight upon the steeper hills. But the fine day was not to be missed, so she would go by train. If her niece really wanted to revisit Duntarvie, why not do so that day? They could travel together as far as Perth. So it was. At Perth, Joanna saw her aunt drive off in a hired carriage, and herself returning to the booking office, she took her ticket to the village from which Duntarvie was but 3 miles distant. Though she had nearly an hour to wait for her train, she could not leave the magic enclosure of the station. She was filled there, for the first time these many days, with the strangest expectancy, and even apart from this, she found pleasure in the bustling holiday sight. Kilted men with guns swung past her, followed by excited retriever dogs. Anglers in shabby homespuns, carrying their rods and baskets, moved more philosophically. Everywhere trolleys heaped with kit bags and golf clubs blocked the way. Children clutching green butterfly nets hurried before their parents across the big black iron bridge. They were fearful lest they should not find their platform in this widespread network of arrival and departure. How well Joanna remembered that trembling lest the others should lag and keep one back, and so one's heart be broken by the sight of a missed train. Duntarvie, Duntarvie. Would the stream still be flowing clear brown, and its furry stones be sheltering the spotted trout? Would the heron still have his nest upon the island in the upper pond? Would the blaeberries be ripe and the larches heavy with their swinging tassels? In the refreshment room, to which she was driven by a slight dizziness, memory was further assailed by a vision of her mother's unslept but ardent face of travel. It had always been part of the ritual of the long journey from Glasgow that Julie should take her children here to drink tea, out of these thick white cups that had the thrilling word Perth emblazoned across them upon a blue strap. Having ordered tea, she went to a small table opposite the entrance. Above that was the clock, and even while she raised the cup to her lips, she could hardly take her eyes from the slow, jerking minute hand upon the dial. Only 20 minutes now, and she would be on her way. A traveller came pushing himself in between the swing doors. He wore a sporting suit of loud and gay pattern of tweed, woven perhaps in Scotland, but destined for no Scotsman to wear, and slung from his shoulders was a bulging rucksack. "Carl! Carl Nilsson! My dear, dear Carl!" Impetuously Joanna started from her seat and ran toward the newcomer, all the other people in the restaurant looking up to watch the meeting. Strangers will always watch with a good deal of interest what is clearly a chance meeting. On this occasion, one at least of the onlookers, a stout woman of unimaginative appearance enough, was so anxious not to miss a single clue that she could spare no glance for the lump of sugar which she held suspended halfway to her cup. She dropped it with a clatter on the marble tabletop, and even then did not take her eyes from Joanna's face. Indeed, Carl's queer clothes and foreign looks notwithstanding, it seemed to be Joanna rather than he that held the attention of the onlookers. Quite apart from dress and feature, Joanna had lately got that in her presence which put her apart and set people speculating. She looked young, not more, decided the stout observer, than 25, yet she had already discarded that density which is peculiarly the mark of youthful flesh. Had she perhaps just recovered from an illness? That seemed ruled out by the bounding movement of greeting with which she had run forward. Neither was she particularly thin. Yet there was a difference, a rarity, something that marked her out. And how came Carl to be in Perth? And how Joanna? The better to talk, they sat down at her table, and she told him briefly of her doings. It was more than 2 years since they had met, and Joanna could feel her friend's clever eyes noting the changes in her. In him, except that the last traces of red had vanished from the grey of his beard, she could see no difference. When she seemed to have no more to say, he told her that he was even now on his way to meet Lawrence Urquhart. Lawrence had been ill. She had not heard? Well, he was better now, or nearly so, and together they were going to make what Carl called a footing tour in Fife. Carl had long wished to see the Fife villages, which were said to be like villages in the Low Countries. Lawrence was also to see them now for the first time. Cooper, Falkland, Auchtermuchty, Strathmiglo, such promising names as they had. Did Joanna know any of them? She did? Good. What now of the ancient royal borough of Auchtermuchty? It was there he was going to meet Lawrence that afternoon. Was it a place to be sketched? Had it, as the guidebook assured him, a beautiful town hall? After having declared eagerly that she well knew Auchtermuchty, Joanna discovered that she could tell Carl nothing definite about it. It lay little more than 5 miles from Duntarvie, so that she had been there many a time. She remembered the horse shows there, the crowded country races her father had enjoyed in spite of his principles, the great July fair, where as children they had crunched bright pink sugar hearts and wondered if they would be kidnapped by gypsies. But as to the size of the town, its situation, its architecture, as to anything indeed which might have been of use to Carl and Lawrence, she was so ignorant that she began to wonder if in reality she had ever been there at all. She was all the more anxious to go to Duntarvie, to make sure beyond a doubt whether a certain whitewashed house and red-tiled steading had once stood in a fold of moorland. But in the middle of her talk of Duntarvie, she became aware that Carl was looking at her with a thoughtfulness not caused by her words. "Meet us at Auchtermuchty tomorrow," he said, as she faltered into silence. "See your Duntarvie, if you must. Look your fill. I see you have to go. But get your memories over and be done with them. Stay the night at your village, and in the morning walk across and join us. We shall wait for you. Here is the name of our inn. But you'll probably find me sketching the town hall and Lawrence looking for Roman rubbish." He watched her closely. "I told my aunt that I should be back in time for dinner tonight." "Oh, la, the aunt!" laughed Carl. "You sent her a telegram." "Do you think I should? But truly, Carl." Her whole being seemed arrested, waiting for his answer. "I have suggested it, perhaps wrongly. The matter is one you must decide for yourself," Carl replied after a moment. "But I cannot decide anything these days. You must help me, Carl. Do, please, help me." She begged him most earnestly. "Are you a free woman?" At his so abrupt question, a very billow of blood swept over her from head to foot, but she raised her suffused eyes and faced him bravely. "Yes," she said, "I'm free, quite free. But I know nothing, and I am so weak. I know nothing. I can't tell what I should do. I'm blown by any wind. There seems no life in me." Carl took her shaking hand and patted it kindly. "Go send the telegram," he bade her, as if it were a child he spoke to. I'm heartily glad of what you tell me, more glad than I can say. Go send the telegram. I will meet you at the train. It seems we go so far together." Joanna lost no time, but she was not flurried. In spite of her grave face, her steps to the telegraph office were set almost to a dancing rhythm. Dear Carl, good dear Carl! What had she ever done to deserve such a friend? A slight but not a painful constraint arose between them upon the short journey. They had the musty compartment of the little puffing train to themselves, and she was hoping that Carl would tell her more of Lawrence and his illness. Nothing, however, seemed farther from Carl's intention, nor could she bring herself to question him till the moment of parting was almost upon them. Instead, therefore, they spoke of Joanna's work in London, of changes in Glasgow, of Feemy's expected visit home that October. Yet Joanna was happier than she knew, and as the train came nearer and nearer to Duntarvie, she grew eager in pointing out each well-remembered landmark. There was the tower, which some people said had not been built by the Picts. There the church. There the queer pointed hill that wore its fir woods as though they were a cloak and a plume of feathers, so that she had always thought it looked like a highway robber. Every moment established her belief that Duntarvie was a real place after all, and her companion's praise of the countryside gave her keen joy. These were hills and woods and rivers that she herself would never be able to see with the painter's eye, but she was lovelily proud to have their beauty vindicated by one who could. They were jogging slowly into the station, which seemed even smaller than her memory of it, when at last she turned from the window and spoke with timid haste. Carl had said Lawrence had been ill. Did he mean that he had been seriously ill? Carl replied with a certain dryness that this was precisely what he had meant. Lawrence, he said, had quite unexpectedly turned up at his studio in Glasgow. Early one morning in June it was, straight from a night journey. He was then suffering from a chill, which was bad enough to account for the sharp illness that had followed. But what had made Carl more anxious was the wretched slowness of the convalescence. There had been one unaccountable relapse after another. The whole thing, a regular break in health rather than any specific illness. In his last letter, however, Lawrence had declared himself fit for the footing tour. This sunshine, if only it would last, and really today it looked like it, should help to set him up. There was no time for more. A warm grip of Carl's hand, a glance, grave and trustful on her part, smiling and kindly on his, a renewal of her promise to meet them without fail the next day, and Joanna was alone. She watched the tail of the train carrying Carl off till it disappeared at leisure round a distant hill corner. Then, crossing the rails by the footboard, she walked up the lane, past the round tower where an iron ring for the necks of felons was still fixed at a height for misery in the stones, and so on into the village. End of section 31. Section 32 of Open the Door. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leena, Emsley. Open the Door by Catherine CARSWELL. Book 3, Chapter 5, Part 2. 5. To her delight, it was just as she remembered it. A little smaller, perhaps, as the station had been, but otherwise unchanged. The single wide street still straggled unevenly downhill, keeping many levels in one width of its close-set cobbles. And there, perched on its mound at the top of the village, was Tweedy's, the post office and principal shop. It too looked the same as it had always looked. The same stiff bunches of boots and breeches stuck out from its dark doorway, the same smell of cheese and porpoise bootlaces, paraffin and bacon came forth from it. Not before she entered, and Joanna did enter, for in Tweedy she knew she would learn whatever was to be known of Duntarvie and its present owners, would she have discovered that old sandy-haired Tweedy was dead, and that young sandy-haired Tweedy, already a bald-headed man, was the master. But this was as nothing to the news of Duntarvie that she brought with her out of that cavern of boots and breeches. During the last 18 years, Tweedy had said, the house had changed hands many times. It had been found too solitary for domestic use, too cold in the winter for the poultry-keeping attempted by one tenant. The soil was too poor to make the place profitable for the ordinary farmer. So for some years it had stood empty, till 6 months ago it had been taken over by the parish authorities. Now it was used for housing old and mindless paupers. There they might indulge in their feeble antics in the sunshine without distressing their fellows. Here was a change to be faced. Joanna, however, recovered her serenity as she stood a while outside and surveyed the basking village. If Duntarvie House, she reminded herself, had become a place of sadness, there was still the moor, the burn, the upper pond, and what were the mere 4 walls compared with these in her memory? Save for its inmates, who were quiet and never strayed beyond the lawn, Tweedy had assured her that the place was quite unchanged. After all, perhaps a few poor old lunatics were less hateful as tenants than would have been some strenuous family who would rebuild the steadings, or some speculative farmer who would divide the moor into hen-runs. She ate in the village, also buying food to take with her, so that she might be free for her next meal. Then, leaving the main road by a rough old short-cut that was more like the dry bed of a stream than a path, she set out. It was late in the afternoon when she gained a track that ran thread-like high up around the flank of a hill, and still she was but half-way to her destination. But she would not hurry. She was kept loitering, partly perhaps by some dread of what might await her, but much more by the quiet new vitality which seemed to well, more and more sweetly, more and more surely, in her with every step. How still it was, almost sombre, in the strong late sunshine. The birds did not sing. The larger ones only called and called to one another, while the smaller, brown dunnocks, green and yellow siskins, finches and linnets of every variety, fluttered silently from bush to bush, or twittered vigilantly in the undergrowth. The leafage everywhere was of that dark, lack-lustre green, which is as different from the green furze of spring as from the flaming red and yellow of later autumn. Yet was that mighty business of scattering, of which the scarlet banners of October only mark the end, already well on its way. Lying with her eyes shut among the bushes of broom and whin, Joanna heard all around her the tiny, sharp reverberations of pods splitting in the blessed heat. Opening her eyes, she saw 1,000 acorns pushing out their blunt and glossy noses from beneath the dark foliage. She espied 1,000,000 winged fruits, which from having long hung aimlessly upon the parent boughs, now lifted themselves in swarms, ready with every pinion spread for the wind. She held in her wondering fingers the purple-black riven pods that disclosed each one a row of ebony seeds embedded in silvery silken down. Fir cones, that were now no more than empty hives, lay everywhere around her. Others, untimely fallen, would never yield up their fruits, but would sink tightly clenched into dissolution. The whole earth was strewn with the signs and wonders, the triumphs and the vast wastage of the year's fulfilment. Even in the sun's decline it was hot, and Joanna, finding a knee-deep pool in the stream, all overgrown at that part, with elder and rowan trees, and hazels rich with nut clusters, stripped herself and bathed. With its pale, sandy bottom and moss-covered stones, and its little brown fall that gushed from above, it made a lovely bath. Half sitting, half lying in it, the young woman let the water splash upon her shoulders and run in a rivulet between her breasts. For some minutes she stayed there, watching the flecks of sunshine move among the rippled pebbles. Then, feeling fresh to the heart, she regained the main road and went more steadily on her way. Duntarvie lay 2 miles farther on, still uphill, at the end of its own steep and rocky road, which, being tree-embowered for the last 50 yards or so, had always been known to the children as the avenue. Emerging from there to the open space before the house, Joanna stopped and sadly looked. It was more forlorn than she had expected. Yet she was comforted also. for a faint wisp of smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, and some hens that picked about the scratched grass behind sagging palings, were the only signs of human habitation. She had dreaded the sight of strangers on the lawn. Slowly, and with some backward looks, she passed on. She crossed to where the hunched-up red and grey steading seemed to have settled so deeply into the earth as to have become one with it, stooped below the iron girders of the mill shaft, to which no horse had been harnessed these 50 years and more, and skirting the shrunken lower pond, began to climb the slope beyond among the beech trees. Nothing suffers more from human abuse than water, and when Joanna had seen the well, covered with broken boards and nettles, and the pond, with its stream half-choked and its banks a wide margin of mud, she trembled for the heron's pool, which supplied the house from the summit of the hill behind. There, however, she must go that night. The moor could wait till the morning. She would cross it on her way to Auchtermuchty. On her reaching the place, it seemed at first as if her worst fears were to be realised, and her heart sank heavily. Here were the trees, all standing round on guard as she remembered them. There was no touch of spoliation anywhere. But in the cup below her, she could see only unbroken greenness. Where was the water she had so loved? The water that had figured all these years as a kind of shrouded symbol in her life. Had it disappeared, or had it never been? Then, even as she looked, a breeze came running through the trees at her back, and stirred the rushes, and the pale green evening sky discovered for her, as if by a spoken word, the living glitter of waters. There it was. There was its perfect circle as of old. There was the living, undespoilable spring that had been set here to spill and spill forever from its far-hidden source in the earth. So, after all, one need not despair. Joanna remembered how, when her life had lain broken within her, the water had sung to her from its tank in the Edinburgh Hotel bedroom, and it was this now silent, almost hidden water that had made hopeful music for her when she lay a child in bed in the house below. If I forget thee, may my right hand forget its cunning. That had been the vague but fervent exclamation of her childhood in this spot. Indeed, she had forgotten. All these years, in her striving for the world, in her keeping Lewis Pender as her centre of energy, with the whole force of her wits and her strongly disciplined will, she had been madly oblivious to the sweet hint vouchsafed to her in childhood. She had forgotten because she had never truly understood. And so it was good to have forgotten. One had to forget first. One had first to expend and lose utterly all the disastrous cunning of one's right hand before one could at last simply be as one was meant to be. Here surely was the new birth. Why it should have to come by such a widely circling and deathly route, why so much pain and wastage should intervene before one could start fair, was a vain question. Enough that for her, at any rate, there could have been no other way. She could look back now, without regret or sadness, to the beginning, when her life had been as a seed enfolded in a double mesh of desire. On desire her life had fed these many years, imprisoned but ripening. A long agony it had been, for she had never known to which desire she must be given, to the desire of sacrifice or to the desire of pride. Each had asserted its sole claim, each had denied that the other had any right in her. And so she had turned from one to the other in a torture of ignorance and indecision. Only now that both had fallen away, outworn, did she come by the steady knowledge that both had been needed, that in the following of one alone there would have been sterility. Why then regret? That period of life, conscious and striving but blind, was past. She was free of it, in knowing she could not have been free without it. Now her absolved self had its birth. No moon rose behind the low, straight band of cloud that girdled the horizon, but the sky had become a dark, belted cupola of stars. Joanna wandered through forest clearings and across the open country where the dew-slippery grass showed like a grey web among the black bushes of whin and heather. She sat on a high stone dyke, ate some biscuits and raisins, and wondered where she should sleep. The idea of sleep came suddenly overpowering, but it was too wet to lie in the open, and she could not bring herself to knock at the doors of Duntarvie. Here and there in the distance from her high perch, she could see the tiny lights of farmhouses, but none seemed within a mile of her, and she felt too tired to go so far. She bethought herself of the steading below, and went back there quickly. Her desire to throw herself down in some dry, dark place and sleep grew upon her with every step. The barn was locked. She could hear the sleepy rustling and fluffing and clucking of the enviable fowls inside. So was the old byre door locked, but to her joy, the latch of what in her childhood had been the stable yielded under her thumb. It was dark inside, for there were only a few small panes of cobwebbed glass among the tiles of the roof. But she groped about and soon found her bearings. Clearly the place was used by the present owners as a byre, for there was no mistaking the warm, sweet redolence of cows, and these were no horses that sighed and snuffled in the two stalls. Joanna's relief was all the greater when she stumbled up against the old stable bin in its accustomed place, standing a little way out from the wall so that the lid could be propped upright. Best of all, it was full to within a foot of the top with some kind of chaff mixture. It was a great metal box, long as a coffin and far deeper, and saving that it was rather narrow, a better bed could hardly have been found. Throwing off her hat and shoes, and spreading her short coat over her as a cover, Joanna climbed in. The chaff yielded comfortably to her hips and shoulders. In 5 minutes she was asleep. She slept fitfully, however, being straightened for room, and woke again and again to long, albeit peacefully enough, for the morning. Her deepest bout of sleep was the last, which carried her far past dawn, and she sat up half in fear to the long-drawn pipe of a starling on the chimney outside. Fine as the bird's whistle, a golden rapier of sunlight lay across her body in the corn bin. She looked at her watch. 6 o'clock, so late! The wonder was that no one had come from the house yet to see to the cows. She felt ravenous. When she had put on her shoes, shaken her clothes free of the chaff bedding, and gone out into the pearly morning, she could see no sign of anyone stirring. Her good fortune seemed assured, by the kitchen blinds being still drawn, so hastening back to the byre, she laid hold of a metal dipper which had been in the bin, and with soothing words she approached one of the cows. To her relief, the beast looked round at her, mildly wrinkling a velvety neck, and did not low. Joanna's experience of milking was limited to a few half-playful lessons in childhood, in this very building, and she was unsure of herself, but she crouched down resolutely and grasped the 2 near teats. So. One must go on tugging firmly, and with a fearless rhythm, that she knew. She laughed as 2 sudden, hard, white spurts came sideways at her like arrows, striking warm to her knees through her woollen skirts, and thence dribbling to the ground. Soon the milk was coming bravely. The only difficulty now was to direct it from the slippery teats into a small and awkwardly shaped vessel beneath. For once that the criss-cross darts went hissing into the dipper, they would 3 times slither over the byre floor, blackening the cobbles, forming small white pools upon the hard earth between, or driving skewer-like into the soft round heaps of cow-dung. But Joanna persevered, and by the time she was warm through and through, and her fingers cramped with clinging to the heavy, freckled udder, there was a good cupful for her breakfast. Splendid it was, too, clover fresh and sweet and warm, and with the last of the biscuits it stayed immediate hunger. The next minute she was out in the sunshine. She crossed the stream at a bound, climbed over the squeaking wire fence, and was straightway on the old moor. The morning, for its freshness, might have been the first of creation. Small, gleeful birds whistled in the winds, which were bound each to each by 1,000 radiant spiders' webs, and Joanna, as she broke through them, loving what she must destroy, stooped to pick handfuls of bloom-grey blaeberries. She could still hear the strange, long, satisfied cries of the starlings on the steading roof, and magpies and warps went circling and calling in the further fields. A lark flew up voiceless from her feet. A weasel darted behind a boulder. As she got higher, she saw that the greater part of the moor was now a plantation of baby pines and firs and larches. In 10 years' time, it would be a moor no longer, but a forest. As yet, however, the little sturdy conifers, few of them over 2 feet in height, had not interfered with the heather, the high-growing blaeberry plants, or the tufts of long, needle-like grass interspersed with clumps of wild thyme which lay between. It was happiness just to pass between these young trees that sprang everywhere with such delicate, balanced strength, and were so dew-covered and innocent. Already the moisture was being sucked up so swiftly by the sun that it could almost be felt flying skywards in an ecstasy. And when, after some wandering, Joanna came to the corner she sought, she found the ground almost dry. Here at the boundary of the moor, where dark old woods lay beyond the lichen-covered paling, the hollow of grass and heather received the sun as if in a chalice. Choosing a springy tussock of heather near some rocks, she sat herself down in great contentment, to wonder what she should do next. It was still too early to start for Auchtermuchty. To Duntarvie House, with its forbidding decrepitude, she would not return. She began to trifle with the idea of making Drumwarry Farm, away to the south. Perhaps they would give her breakfast there, before she went on her way over the Fife border. Surely at Drumwarry there would still be someone who remembered the Bannermans. To Drumwarry she would go. Presently, that was. Not quite yet. The sun was indeed getting at her in this sheltered cup. It was getting her most gratefully at her very marrow, and now a drowsiness swam along her limbs and drew her film after film over her eyelids. She had slept in the corn-bin, but not enough for her need. Now her eyelids fell, and her head sank toward one shoulder. Her last conscious movement, before yielding utterly, was a pushing, an insinuating of herself as far into the bush of heather as she could get. With a comfortable sigh she settled yet more deeply. On all sides she was supported by the springy stems, yet she was so far sunken out of sight that the warm, rustling flowers nearly met over her. When she was awakened by the abrupt ka-uck, ka-uck of a cock-pheasant quite close to her ear, it was in her firm belief that she had slept but a few minutes. Yet it was past 10 by her watch, and the sun had mounted high in the sky. Had it not been for the shade of a larch bough, its rays must have beat her eyes open long ere then. As she rose, stretching herself, leaving such a deep impression of her body in the heather that it would be days before the fine grey thongs would stand again upright, the cock-pheasant stalked out of sight. His gait declared that he was prudent, but that he refused to be hurried. 2 young rabbits nibbling near the fence were less careful for their dignity. Perching on a boulder higher up, Joanna shaded her eyes and searched toward the south for a sign of Drumwarry. It was with a touch of incredulity that she recognised, well within a mile of where she stood, the dark slate gables and the high old smoke stalk, which in childhood had seemed a day's journey across the steeply curving hillsides. She was about to descend from her rock, facing a little the other way to avoid the sun in her eyes, when something made her gather herself back into intent, balanced stillness. Away on the moor, a jerkily moving object caught the sunlight. It was the bare, black head of a man, who was otherwise hidden by rising ground and winds. It moved along quickly, sometimes bobbing up and down as its owner ran a few steps or leapt over the knots of heather, sometimes disappearing completely behind a hillock, but always widening the distance between itself and her. Now it had gone, and Joanna watched for its reappearance with a feeling in her heart different from anything she had ever known before. Now it came again into sight, followed rapidly by the shoulders and the man's whole body, as he mounted a little hill, perhaps 200 yards away. She knew then, beyond all doubt, that it was Lawrence, and no other, that was here on the moor with her. and it was only then that she was pierced through and through by the clue of her own new-born life. Clear as the starling's whistle, piercing as the first ray of the morning, she knew her happiness and hailed it. But he had not seen her. He did not know. He was not even looking for her. As fast as he could, he was walking away and away. Soon, in a moment, he would be gone. He must not go. Every thought, every desire, every invigorated cell of Joanna's renewed body leapt on the instant in unison with this declaration of her spirit. Lawrence must not go. She must stop him. She had never known anything as she knew this. She had never experienced living knowledge till now. Lawrence, too, must be pierced with this new, dazzling ray of knowledge, or there would remain only darkness. She started running at top speed. First she went pelting down her hillock, losing all sight of him. Then, zigzagging like a hare along the clear passage of grass that wound pale yellow between the winds, and springing over the sapling pines, she breasted the longer hill in front. She could see him again now. If only he would turn round. But no. He stared sometimes a little to the right or to the left, but never turned his face enough for any movement from behind to catch his eye, and not once did he glance back. What breeze there was on these heights was contrary, and so would prevent the sound of her running from reaching him till she should come up close. Once or twice she thought she could hear that he whistled to himself as he walked. He looked young and carefree, with his coat off and thrown over one shoulder, and though the breath was failing her, a spendthrift laugh escaped her when she saw him go flying over a particularly wide obstacle of rock and heather. She had reached the top of the second hillock between them, he meanwhile climbing also, when her plight began to seem desperate. The last push uphill had made her breathing fearfully ragged, and she had reached the top just in time to avoid falling. She realized also, what she had not grasped before, that her task was not merely to cover the stretch of uneven ground between herself and Lawrence, but to overtake him as well. If she could not gain seriously on him by the next plunge downhill, and across the intervening shallow dip, before he was again descending at a helter-skelter pace, she was done. She was lost. She would have to sink mute upon the earth while he would go on whistling and unknowing. It was too late to attract his attention by calling. Even if she had tried to shout earlier, with the wind as it was, it would most likely have been mere waste of precious breath. Precious breath indeed. Now it was too late for the weakest cheep of a hoy, hoy. She would soon have no breath left for anything, not even for survival. She plunged down the hill, not zigzagging now, but jumping and stumbling straight forward, sometimes falling on her hands and knees. The braid of her skirt was torn into festoons, and her knees trembled shockingly. It was even worse going downhill than up, but she went on, and across the amber-coloured dip which was full of quivering air. Only twice before in her life had she run so. Once it had been up the Glasgow hill to her first meeting with Lewis, under the dread that he would be gone, and once it had been along the winding shore road to the west coast village where her mother lay dying. She remembered these times now, once for love, once for death. Her blood took up the refrain with its bursting throbs, once for love, once for death. This time for life. It was life that she ran for now. Life. Few there be that find it. Life, that for her Lawrence held in his keeping, and was carrying swiftly away. Again she had lost sight of him, and the knowledge that as she was crawling up this next slippery hill, he was going pell-mell downwards, nearly killed her. She uttered his name now in gasping, voiceless breaths, though she knew it was worse than useless. But she could not refrain. If only he would stop for one moment. To die with one last short breath on his breast would be better than to recover in solitude. There was no real recovery for her but on his breast. If she fell short of him, her heart would break. It was breaking now. She had to keep her hand pressed over it. Why did he go so fast and never stop? The fury of anger against him ran parallel with her desire. She loved him. needed him, hated him all at once. With the tears pouring down her scarlet cheeks and all her features convulsed like a frantic lost child's, she got somehow over the brow of the hill and looked for him. He had stopped. He had turned round. She heard him shout, saw him come running towards her, and she tried to raise her arm in a signal. Though she was saved, she could not have stopped running now, not if she had known the next stop to be her last. But soon they were only a few paces apart, and Lawrence, becoming suddenly unsure, stood still. He uttered some inarticulate sounds of question and welcome, but knew that he must wait for her. There was a treacherous looped root of heather in the turf between them, and Joanna was no longer able to lift her feet, nor to look where she was going. With her eyes on Lawrence's face, she tripped badly on the root, and as he darted forward to save her, she pitched forward right upon his breast. For what to both seemed a long time, no word was spoken. Joanna clearly was quite unfit for speech. Her breath came and went in painful, sobbing gasps, do what she would to allay it, and her tumultuous heartbeats shook her body through and through. As for Lawrence, silence was his better part. He could only hold his love to him in fearful happiness, but as soon as she began to draw away from him, he let her go. Still she panted. Her hair was fallen in a lump on one shoulder. Her moist face blazed like heather flowers in September sunshine after a rain shower. She groped in her skirts and in her bosom. "I must have lost my handkerchief." Lawrence pulled out his, a comfortable male square of linen, and put it in her hand. "Thank you," she murmured fervently, and when her face was a little comforted, she added seriously, "I ran after you." Lawrence threw back his head and laughed to the sky. "You did that," he replied when he could speak. Then, "See, sit down here," he went on, as if he were coaxing some panicky animal. "Here's a good seat. Take your time. You must have run ever so far to get yourself in such a state. Why didn't you shout to me?" "The wind was against me, then my breath was gone," said Joanna. She was recovering, but still had to heave great sighs, and she pressed her hands to her flaming cheeks. "Rest a bit," urged Lawrence as she tried to rise. "Could you drink some cold coffee? I have some here, see." He knelt beside her, unfastening his rucksack, while Joanna tried to twist up her hair. "All my hairpins are gone," she complained. "I'm afraid I can't help you there." "No, I shall just have to plait it." With practised fingers that seemed to her companion to accomplish a miracle of skilfulness, she made a long braid of her hair and doubled it up under her soft hat. "I think I'll never be cool again." "Not up here, certainly," agreed Lawrence. "Shall we go down among these trees? There should surely be a burn there." She nodded. "There is. My burn. Let's go." And she scrambled to her feet. "But first here's your coffee," he said, giving her a cup, and she drank gratefully. As she handed him back the empty cup, their eyes met, and it was as if each now saw the other for the first time. Only now did Joanna clearly note the marks of his recent illness in his face, but it was no more this that kept her eyes so long upon his than it was her morning freshness that made Lawrence gaze on her as if he could never look elsewhere. Never before had their primary flames of being leapt up so nakedly, and they were full of recognition, each for the other. There on the moor, that vibrated with noonday, he was Adam to her Eve. There among the broom brushes, whereupon the dark seed pods went cracking in the strong sunshine, the past was shed from both of them like a garment, nor did any future as yet exist for them. They were in the beginning of their new creation. "Did you see me on the rock?" A question leapt at last from her. "Were you trying to get away when I ran after you?" "I didn't see you," he replied. "Not until I turned and you were quite close. How can you ask? I would never run from you. I must always follow you. Forever." Joanna had never listened to words of such penetrating sweetness. "If I hadn't caught up on you," she said, "I should have died." "And I said Lawrence, should never have lived. They went for shade down to the burn, and there they sat to talk. They talked till the afternoon drew in, but it seemed to them that they could never be done disclosing to each other the so widely differing courses of their two lives, which had yet converged at last. Joanna told about Gerald, her first love, who close by where they sat had skinned the wild birds, and about Alec Peddy's offer in this very spot, how Lawrence laughed at that, to show her what lads were for. And she talked of Mario and Italy and Aunt Purdy. Of Lewis she found she could not yet speak plainly. The reminiscent misery of that was still too raw. But when she told, as she did, of the secret garden door of La Porziuncola, and of all that love had meant to her, escape, adventure, excitement, learning, possession of the world, she found that Lawrence understood. She knew well that no corner of her life would be, or need ever be, kept from him. And when in turn he told her of his life, she listened amazed. Where she had been as a field under the harrow, never left in peace, he had lived folded in upon himself. She knew now what he, and Carl too, had meant, when they reckoned him as the seed, and her as the clod of earth. For in her had lain his one means of escape, and she had denied him. Elsewhere he had been able neither to give nor to take, in any vital way. His essence and his treasure had lain hoarded up for her alone. In an interval of their talk, she laved her face in the stream, and they squatted gaily to share the food Lawrence had brought in his rucksack. When they had eaten it all, they fell silent at last. Joanna rested, leaning slackly against a beech trunk. Her hat was off, so that the long, unfastened braid of her hair hung fallen behind like a schoolgirl's, and round her forehead the smaller locks clung to the skin in damp rings. Except for the bright patch of sunburn where her linen blouse fell open at the neck, and a vivid stain on either forearm, she now looked cool as satin. "How old are you?" asked Lawrence out of the quietness. 30. "I suppose you are." "Why?" She answered the wonder of his tone. "How old do I look to you?" "No particular age, but you just look such a lassie," he said. "Not weary and worn?" "Not now, at any rate." "But sometimes, eh? When I look like a juggler, you remember?" "Yes, I've seen you so, and you looked horribly beautiful. All the same, I like best for you to be as you are now. You were meant to be all freshness. Yet one has to grow old and even middle-aged, and 30 is a good way towards it?" she questioned wistfully. "My love, you needn't be anxious. There is more youth in you, more real youth, than a girl of 17. "I believe that is true. Yet somehow I know it here with you now," she agreed simply, all her face bright. "How old are you, Lawrence?" 28. "So much younger than I, and yes, you look it, alas." "Do you mind?" "Not really. I don't think so, at least." "You shouldn't," he assured her. "There was a time when I was too young for you, heaps too young, but I've made up since then. Soon I shall be far older than you, though I hope not too old. Compare the shape of our heads. I am of an older race. What you have come through would have made tatters of me long ago. Physically I might have held out. I have a toughness of fibre. I found that out when I was ill. But not a bit of freshness would have been left. If I had spent myself as you have, I could never have laughed as you laughed a moment ago. I'm a frail sort of being beside you, Joanna." "You do make me sound a tough old thing," she protested. "Not tough. Sturdy," he corrected her. "Like one of those sapling firs up there that shoot up all the stronger for being buffeted about by the wind." Later, they climbed the grey dyke and went swinging in true lover's rhythm down the hilly road toward the village where Carl would be waiting. As they came near it, they passed with their happiness between the new scythed shocks of wheat that bent in their places meekly as if praying. "Happy?" asked Lawrence, breaking a long, unconscious silence. Joanna laughed quietly in response. "I haven't thought," she admitted. "But I have, though," said he, "and I know you are, by your voice." "It is true, Lawrence," she replied. "I think my heart never felt light till now." "Nor mine either." "See, the moon!" Together at Joanna's cry they wheeled to look. Amid the flock of little clouds behind them, a young, misshapen moon had been speeding up unseen. Now each cloud, holding fast its own seed of darkness, floated apart in a pale, transparent spume of light. "Like the seed of a passion flower, aren't they?" murmured Joanna. "Aye, no need to ask the moon if she is happy," Lawrence mused. "She looks fulfilled, like a web of ripe seeds that has this moment been scattered." The end. End of section 32. End of Open the Door by Catherine Carswell.